I found the notebook by accident. That was the part that still unsettles me most. Not because the notebook existed, because for one brief moment before I opened it, my life still felt normal. Sandra and I were shopping downtown on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Nothing dramatic. Just bookstores, coffee, and the kind of slow, wandering mothers and daughters do when they are trying to feel close again after difficult months. Things had actually been calmer lately. No labels. No trackers. No careful questions about memory. At least not openly. That afternoon almost felt like the old version of us again. Then Sandra left her purse on the café chair while she went to the restroom. A simple accident. The purse tipped sideways onto the floor when I stood to move it away from someone walking past our table. Lipstick, wallet, receipts, and a small black notebook. It slid halfway beneath the chair near my feet. I reached down automatically to pick it up. The notebook opened when I grabbed it, just enough for me to see the first page, large handwriting. Blue ink, underlined title. SIGNS Mom is Getting Worse. The world seemed to narrow instantly around those 5 words. I stared down at the page while cafe noise blurred softly into the background. Rain against windows, silverware clinking, coffee machines hissing, normal sounds, yet suddenly nothing felt normal anymore. My hands started shaking before I even realized I was trembling. I should have closed it immediately. I know that. But once you see a title like that attached to yourself, some terrible part of you needs to know. The first bullet point sat directly beneath the title. Repeated story about Richard's fishing trip, March 12. My stomach tightened painfully, not because I repeated the story. Because someone documented it, not remembered casually, not noticed emotionally, documented. I turned the page before I could stop myself. Forgot pharmacy receipt in purse for 3 days. Asked same question twice during dinner. Couldn't remember neighbor's grandson's name. Tiny moments. Tiny ordinary human moments, collected like evidence. The cafe suddenly felt too warm, too bright. Then another line caught my eye. Seemed confused after waking from nap, possible sundening. Sundening. The word hit me like ice water. Medical language, clinical language. Not tired, not groggy. Symptom language. I flipped another page. Questions to monitor. Does she repeat stories more frequently? Does she forget familiar routes? Does she seem emotionally flat? Is she hiding confusion better lately? Hiding confusion better lately. The sentence hollowed me completely, because suddenly I understood something terrifying. Every calm moment lately, every ordinary conversation, every improvement, had still been filtered through suspicion. I closed the notebook instantly when Sandra returned. Too late. The moment she saw it in my hands, all the color drained from her face. Not confusion, terror, real terror. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then softly, "Mom!" The cafe disappeared around me completely. I stared at her while the notebook sat between us on the table like physical proof of fear. "How long?" Sandra lowered herself slowly into the chair. "It's not what you think." There it was. The universal sentence people say right before confirming exactly what you think. I looked down at the notebook again. SIGNS Mom is Getting Worse. Not things worrying me about Mom. Questions after Dad died. Worse. Meaning somewhere inside Sandra's mind, decline had already become an active progression. I lowered my voice carefully because suddenly I felt like everyone in the cafe could hear my heartbeat. "You keep records about me." Sandra's eyes filled instantly. "It started after the snowstorm. Always the snowstorm. One wrong highway exit during dangerous weather. Fear survives by attaching itself permanently to vulnerable moments." I opened the notebook again despite myself. Page after page, dates, observations, questions, not emotional memories, surveillance. Then another entry caught my eye. May 4, she forgot I already told her about Ethan's baseball game. I stared at the sentence while nausea rolled slowly through my body. One repeated conversation. And someone wrote it down like medical evidence. Then another realization surfaced slowly. "For months," my voice shook slightly now, "you've been watching me." Sandra covered her mouth instantly. Not defensive, not careful, ashamed. We were scared. Again, always scared, never controlling, never humiliating, scared. I looked directly at her. There's a section called Possible Symptoms. Tears slipped silently down her face now. The neurologist said documenting patterns can help. Neurologist again, always experts, always systems. Fear reinforced institutionally until ordinary human behavior slowly becomes data. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. Who else has read this? Sandra hesitated too long. And suddenly I knew the answer would hurt. Michael sometimes. Of course, family conversations again, quiet evaluations, systems forming around me without my knowledge. I stared at the notebook resting between our coffee cups. One forgotten receipt, one repeated story, one emotional year after grief. And suddenly, my daughter quietly started building a written case file about my possible decline. Then another realization surfaced slowly. For weeks, I whispered, I genuinely thought maybe my memory was getting worse because you always seemed to remember every mistake perfectly. The cafe stayed completely still around us. Because there it was again, the real damage, not the notebook, self-doubt. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to question themselves before questioning the people documenting them. I could not touch my coffee after that. The cup sat untouched between us while rain slid slowly down the cafe windows. Normal coffee, normal table. Yet suddenly everything felt contaminated somehow. The notebook remained closed now beside Sandra's purse. Tiny black cover, elastic band, dozens of pages apparently dedicated to tracking my decline. I kept staring at it like it might disappear if I looked long enough. Finally, I whispered, "How many pages are there?" Sandra wiped at her eyes quickly. "Mom, how many?" Silence. Then softly, "Almost full." The room tilted slightly around me, almost full, not a few worried notes, not isolated incidents, months of documentation. I laughed softly, brokenly. "You've been writing about me for months. We were trying to notice patterns. Patterns, interesting word, not grief, not stress, not ordinary aging. Patterns. Fear survives comfortably inside patterns because patterns sound objective. Scientific. I reached for the notebook again before I could stop myself. Sandra flinched visibly, not because I might yell. Because she suddenly understood how horrifying it looked from outside her own fear. I opened to the middle randomly. June 8, repeated concern about losing keys, possible anxiety compensation. June 11, forgot actress name during movie discussion. June 14, mood improved after familiar routines restored. Familiar routines restored. I stared at the sentence. Not, we had a nice day. Clinical language again. As though my emotions had slowly become case observations instead of human experiences. Then another entry caught my eye. June 20, seems more alert in mornings lately. More alert, the same language from the bank teller. Not happy, not energetic, alert, like nurses discussing patients. I closed the notebook immediately because suddenly I felt sick. For months, I whispered, you stopped talking to me like your mother. Sandra shook her head instantly. That's not true. No, I looked directly at her. This reads like behavioral monitoring. The cafe stayed completely still around us, because somewhere deep down, she knew it too. Then Sandra quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. The neurologist said families usually notice changes before doctors do. Again, always the neurologist. Institutional reinforcement quietly validating fear until observation itself starts feeling morally responsible. I folded my hands tightly together. So you became my evaluator. Tears slid silently down Sandra's face now. We thought documenting things early might help later. Later again, always later. Fear survives by preparing emotionally for futures that may never arrive. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. You were comparing me to the notebook during conversations. Sandra froze instantly. The silence answered before her mouth did. Cold spread painfully through my chest. Every pause. Every forgotten word. Every repeated story. Measured. I suddenly remembered dozens of strange moments differently. Sandra watching too carefully when I searched for words. Michael exchanging quick glances with her after I repeated myself once during dinner. Claire asking oddly specific questions about dates and names. At the time, I thought I was imagining tension. Now I understood something worse. They had already turned ordinary conversation into ongoing assessment. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, Sandra saying casually, "You seem really sharp today." Sharp again, always sharp, not relaxed, not happy, sharp. Every good day quietly framed as temporary evidence against expected decline. I stared at the notebook again. "How often did you write in this?" Sandra looked ashamed now. "Almost every day after Dad died." Richard again, always Richard. My husband's death had quietly transformed normal grief behavior into monitored risk factors. I leaned back slowly in the booth. "So while I was mourning my husband," my voice cracked slightly now, "you were collecting evidence." The tears finally slipped fully down Sandra's face, because finally she understood. Not intellectually, emotionally. The notebook was not just observations. It was psychological surveillance disguised as concern. Then Sandra whispered something that nearly broke me. "The first time you forgot where you parked at the grocery store," her voice shook. "I went home and cried for hours." I stared at her. "I forgot one parking spot, but it scared me." There it was again, perfect honesty, not evidence. Fear. Fear had quietly transformed ordinary human imperfection into anticipated tragedy. Then another realization surfaced slowly. "For a while," I whispered, "I started testing myself constantly." Sandra looked up immediately. "Testing? Names, dates." Stories. The room went completely still. "Every time I forgot something small, I wondered whether it would end up in your notebook." Sandra covered her mouth instantly. Not guilt, recognition. Because finally she understood the real damage underneath everything. Not invasion of privacy. Identity distortion. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to experience ordinary human mistakes as possible symptoms too. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard repeating the exact same fishing story every Thanksgiving for 15 years. Everyone laughed. No one documented it, because middle-aged forgetfulness feels human. Elderly forgetfulness feels diagnostic. That was the terrifying difference. I stared toward the rain-darkened street outside the cafe window. Cars passing, people walking. Ordinary life continuing everywhere. Yet suddenly I felt horrifyingly visible, observed, measured, recorded. Then Sandra whispered softly, "We just wanted to catch problems early." Catch problems early. Interesting phrase. Not understand me better, not support me emotionally. Catch problems. Fear had quietly transformed my daughter from family into investigator, long before any actual illness existed. And perhaps the cruelest thing about growing older is this. Sometimes the people who love you become so terrified of future decline, they accidentally stop experiencing your life with you and start documenting it instead. I asked Sandra for the notebook before we left the cafe, not politely either. "I want it." She hesitated immediately. That hesitation frightened me more than anything written inside. Because suddenly, I realized the notebook no longer belonged emotionally to me in her mind. It belonged to fear. "Mom," I said, "give it to me." The cafe stayed softly noisy around us while rain pressed against the windows. Normal Saturday afternoon, normal people drinking coffee. Yet somehow my own life now existed in written observations tucked inside a black notebook between napkins and receipts. Sandra handed it over slowly, like surrendering something fragile. That hurt more than anger would have. I slipped the notebook into my purse without opening it again. I could not bear another page yet. The drive home happened mostly in silence. Halfway there, Sandra finally whispered, "You're acting like I wanted this." Wanted, interesting word, not chose, not continued. Wanted. I stared out the passenger window. "You kept writing in it." The car went silent again, because there was no answer to that. Fear may explain behavior, but repetition turns fear into system eventually. Then another realization surfaced slowly. How many conversations did you and Michael have about me using this notebook? Sandra gripped the steering wheel tighter. Not like you think. No. I suddenly recognized that phrase too. The same phrase people use when reality already sounds terrible spoken aloud. I looked toward her carefully. You compared notes. Silence. Too much silence. Cold spread slowly through my chest. Of course they compared notes. Family meetings. Concerned discussions. Quiet evaluations happening while I sat beside them at Sunday dinners completely unaware. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Michael casually asking, still forgetting words sometimes. At the time I thought he was making conversation. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. He had probably already read entries about word-finding problems. Every interaction suddenly rearranged itself. Not conversation. Follow-up assessment. When we reached my house, I walked directly to the dining room table and opened the notebook again despite myself. Sandra stood frozen near the doorway, watching, always watching now. I flipped through pages faster this time. April 3, couldn't remember neighbor's dog name. April 9, repeated concern about bills already paid. April 12, very emotional after church service. Very emotional. Interesting phrase, not grieving, not vulnerable, emotional. Every normal human response quietly translated into symptom language again. Then another page caught my eye. Possible triggers worsening confusion. Fatigue, stress, loud environments. Discussions about dad. I stared at the words while nausea rolled slowly through my body. Discussions about dad. Richard himself had become categorized as a destabilizing factor. I looked up sharply. You wrote about my grief like it was a symptom. Sandra's face crumpled immediately. No, yes. I turned the notebook toward her. You made lists. The room stayed completely still, because there it was again. The real horror underneath everything, not memory tracking. Medicalization. Fear had quietly transformed ordinary mourning into monitored cognitive behavior. Then Sandra whispered something that hollowed me completely. The neurologist said grief can sometimes accelerate decline. Accelerate decline. Interesting phrase, not cause sadness, not overwhelm concentration. Decline, I stared at my daughter. So after Dad died, you stopped seeing grief and started seeing risk. The tears slipped fully down Sandra's face now, because finally she understood too, not intellectually, emotionally. The notebook had not simply documented observations. It had slowly reframed my entire humanity through the lens of anticipated deterioration. Then another realization surfaced slowly. For months, my voice shook slightly now. Every time you asked how I was feeling, I looked down at the pages. You were probably deciding whether it sounded normal enough. The silence answered everything. Not always perhaps, but enough. Enough to poison ordinary conversation permanently. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, forgetting the word umbrella during lunch. Sandra immediately writing something in her phone afterward. At the time I thought she answered a text. God help me, maybe she was recording it. I gripped the notebook harder. How often did you write things down right after talking to me? Sandra lowered her eyes immediately. Cold spread painfully through my chest. Every hesitation, every repeated sentence, every emotional moment, potential entry material. I suddenly felt exposed in a way I could barely describe, not because mistakes existed, because they were archived. Then Sandra quietly admitted something even worse. Sometimes I reread old entries before seeing you. The room tilted slightly around me. What? So I could compare changes. Compare changes. The sentence hollowed me completely. Not spend time with me. Not reconnect emotionally. Compare. I stared toward the rain-darkened dining room window, and suddenly I understood something terrifying. My daughter had become so frightened of future decline that she no longer entered conversations looking for connection first. She entered them looking for progression. Then another memory surfaced. Richard forgetting where he left his glasses nearly every day after turning 55. Everyone laughed affectionately. No one tracked patterns, because middle-aged forgetfulness feels charming. Elderly forgetfulness becomes data, That was the terrifying difference. I looked back down at the notebook resting in my hands. One forgotten parking spot, one repeated story, one emotional year after grief. Tiny moments repeated often enough until my daughter quietly transformed herself from loving family into someone measuring whether I was becoming less myself over time. Then Sandra whispered softly, "I think I stopped knowing how to just be your daughter." The sentence settled heavily through the silent house. Because finally, maybe for the first time, she understood the actual tragedy underneath everything, not the notebook itself. The way fear had slowly replaced ordinary love with observation. That night after Sandra left, I read the entire notebook. Every page. I do not know why. Maybe because once someone turns your life into documentation, some terrible part of you needs to know the full extent of it. The house stayed silent around me while rain moved softly against the windows. Just me, the notebook, pages of carefully dated concern. April 18, asked whether it was Tuesday twice. May 2, forgot casserole dish at church. May 19, couldn't remember actor's name during movie. Tiny moments, tiny ordinary moments. Yet seeing them written down sequentially made them look ominous somehow. That was the danger of documentation. Anything becomes frightening once arranged chronologically enough. Then another page stopped me cold. Possible positive signs. Still balances checkbook independently, maintains normal hygiene routines, recognizes all family members consistently. I stared at the sentence while cold spread slowly through my chest, not because it was cruel. Because somewhere along the way, my daughter genuinely started considering the possibility that I might someday fail that category. The realization hollowed me completely. Then another horrifying entry appeared farther down. Monitor for increased defensiveness, anger when corrected, paranoia about memory concerns. I closed the notebook instantly. Paranoia. The word echoed painfully inside my head, because suddenly I understood something terrifying. The moment older adults resist observation, resistance itself can become additional evidence. That was the trap. I sat frozen at the dining room table while the refrigerator hummed softly in the dark kitchen nearby. Normal house, normal night. Yet suddenly my own emotions felt dangerous somehow. If I became angry, was that evidence too? If I defended myself, would it become another entry? Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, snapping at Michael after he repeated a story correction twice. At the time I thought I was frustrated. Now my stomach tightened painfully. God help me. Maybe they discussed whether it meant worsening symptoms afterward. I looked back down at the notebook slowly. Fear had created a system where my reactions themselves quietly became part of the case file. Then another realization surfaced. This notebook was not actually neutral documentation. It was interpretation. Sandra deciding what counted as evidence and what did not. Richard forgetting stories for years never became concerning. My repeated stories did. Michael losing his wallet twice last month was funny. My misplaced receipt became an entry. Aging changes interpretation. That was the terrifying part. Then another page caught my eye. Questions for next doctor appointment. Should we limit stressful situations? Is social withdrawal an early warning sign? Should family monitor medication more closely? Family monitor medication more closely. The sentence made me physically ill, not because anyone had taken my medication yet, because suddenly I saw the future they were quietly rehearsing emotionally. One step at a time, one precaution at a time, concern expanding gradually until independence slowly disappeared beneath layers of protection. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. The notebook never once mentioned happiness. Not joy, not resilience, not humor, only function, confusion, patterns, symptoms. Fear had quietly reduced my humanity into measurable cognitive performance. I stared toward the hallway photographs glowing softly in dim light. Richard laughing beside the lake. Sandra at graduation. Ethan missing his front teeth. My life was still full of beauty, yet the notebook saw risk first. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Last month, laughing so hard during dinner I cried because Ethan spilled mashed potatoes everywhere. No entry for that, because fear documents problems, not aliveness. The realization broke something open inside me. Not anger, grief. Then another page stopped me completely. June 27, she seemed more like herself today. I stared at the sentence for a very long time. More like herself. Interesting phrase, not relaxed, not happy herself. Meaning somewhere inside Sandra's mind, there now existed multiple possible versions of me being constantly compared against each other. I whispered aloud into the empty house. I was always myself. The tears finally came then, not loud crying, exhausted crying, because suddenly I understood the deepest wound underneath everything. The notebook had quietly taught my daughter to experience my identity as conditional. Stable today, less stable tomorrow, sharp this morning, confused later. Measured continuously against imagined decline. Then another realization surfaced slowly. For months now, Sandra probably arrived at family dinners already carrying expectations shaped by recent entries, meaning she no longer met me fresh emotionally. She met the notebook's version first. That realization devastated me more than anything else. Then another memory surfaced. Richard forgetting entire conversations sometimes after exhausting work weeks. No one documented him. No one monitored patterns, because middle-aged exhaustion feels temporary. Elderly exhaustion becomes suspicious. That was the cruel difference. I closed the notebook finally and rested both hands on top of it. Tiny black cover, hundreds of observations, so much fear trapped between pages. Then I quietly admitted something to myself for the first time. Part of why the notebook hurt so deeply was because some small, frightened part of me had already started believing it too. That was the real danger of constant observation. Not merely that other people begin seeing you differently. Eventually, you begin seeing yourself through their fear too. And perhaps the cruelest thing about growing older is this. Sometimes the people who love you become so afraid of losing you someday, they accidentally begin recording your humanity like evidence instead of simply living beside it while it's still here. The next morning, I hid the notebook inside Richard's old desk drawer, not because I forgave it, because I could not bear looking at it anymore. Yet somehow even hidden away, it still felt present inside the house, like a silent witness. That was the damage. Once someone begins documenting your life clinically, ordinary moments stop feeling fully private afterward. I found myself becoming strangely careful all day, deliberately repeating nothing. Double-checking names before speaking, pausing before stories to make sure I had not already told them recently, self-monitoring. Fear repeated often enough eventually moves inside older adults too. Around noon, Michael stopped by unexpectedly. The moment I saw him glance toward my face too carefully while saying hello, cold spread softly through my chest again. There it was, observation. Not greeting, not connection, assessment. How are you feeling today? Feeling today. Interesting phrase, not how are you, today. Every interaction now quietly framed against possible fluctuation. I walked into the kitchen slowly. Fine. Michael followed carefully behind me, like someone approaching unstable ground. That hurt more than anger would have. Then another realization surfaced suddenly. I no longer knew which conversations belonged to genuine family concern and which belonged to invisible mental checklists. That uncertainty was exhausting. I opened the refrigerator and forgot briefly why I stood there. Normal human moment, everyone does it. Yet panic surged instantly through my chest. There, evidence. I closed the refrigerator too quickly. Michael noticed immediately. You okay? The question landed heavily. Not because he meant harm, because suddenly every tiny hesitation felt observable. I turned sharply toward him. Do you want me to narrate every thought process out loud now? His face changed instantly. Not anger, shock. Because finally he heard the exhaustion underneath everything. I gripped the kitchen counter tightly. For months, all of you have been quietly measuring me. Michael rubbed his forehead tiredly. That's not fair. No, I laughed softly. Your sister literally kept a notebook titled, Signs Mom is Getting Worse. The room went completely still. Because spoken aloud, even fear sounds horrifying sometimes. Then Michael quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. I told her to write things down. The kitchen tilted slightly around me. What? She kept forgetting which incidents worried her. Incidents, interesting word, not conversations. Not human moments, incidents. Fear had quietly transformed ordinary life into reportable events. I stared at my son. You encouraged this. We thought patterns might matter. Patterns again. Always patterns. Tiny imperfections stitched together until they resemble inevitability. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, Michael casually asking, still getting confused in grocery stores sometimes. At the time I thought he meant stress. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. He had probably read notebook entries beforehand. Every family conversation now rearranged itself into hidden follow-up evaluations. Then Michael whispered something that nearly broke me. The neurologist said documentation helps families notice progression. Progression. There it was again, the underlying assumption beneath everything, not possibility, direction, worse, further. Declining, I sat heavily at the kitchen table because suddenly my legs felt weak. What if there is no progression? Michael stayed silent. What if I'm just grieving? The room remained completely still, because somewhere deep down, he already knew that possibility existed too. Fear had simply become louder. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. If I became upset about the notebook, I looked directly at him. Would that become another symptom too? Michael froze instantly. The silence answered before his mouth did. Cold spread painfully through my chest. Defensiveness, anger, suspicion. The notebook already listed them as warning signs. Meaning resistance itself quietly became suspicious. That was the trap. I suddenly understood why so many older adults stop fighting these narratives eventually. Because every protest risks sounding like further evidence. Then another memory surfaced. Richard snapping irritably at everyone during stressful tax seasons for years. No one questioned his cognition. No one documented mood changes, because middle-aged frustration feels human. Elderly frustration becomes behavioral evidence. That was the cruel difference. I stared toward the rain-darkened kitchen window. You know what hurts most? Michael remained silent. I started feeling nervous before family dinners. His face crumpled immediately. Why? Because I was afraid of giving you material. The tears filled his eyes instantly then, because finally he understood the actual damage underneath everything, not embarrassment. Performance anxiety. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to treat ordinary conversation like evaluation. Then Michael quietly admitted something worse. Sometimes before seeing you, his voice cracked slightly, I reread Sandra's recent notes. The room went cold. What? So I'd know what changes to watch for. Watch for, interesting phrase. Not enjoy time together. Not reconnect emotionally. Watch. I stared at my son across the kitchen table, and suddenly I understood something terrifying. My children no longer arrived at family gatherings looking for connection first. They arrived prepared for assessment. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Ethan telling the same dinosaur fact 6 times during one dinner last month. Everyone smiled affectionately. No one documented repetition, because children repeating themselves feels charming. Older adults repeating themselves feels ominous. That was the terrifying difference. I looked down at my trembling hands resting on the table. One forgotten receipt, one repeated story. One emotional year after grief. Tiny moments repeated often enough until my own children quietly began approaching every interaction already braced for evidence of losing me. Then Michael whispered softly, I think we forgot how to just spend time with you. The sentence settled heavily through the quiet kitchen. Because finally, maybe for the first time, my son understood the true tragedy underneath the notebook, not the observations themselves. The way fear had slowly replaced ordinary love with constant evaluation. 3 days later, Sandra came over again. This time she did not bring the notebook. That mattered more than she probably realized. She stood awkwardly in the kitchen holding two coffees while morning light spilled softly through the windows. No careful questions. No observational pauses, just silence. Uncomfortable human silence. I accepted the coffee slowly, regular coffee, full caffeine, no one monitored whether I should have it. Tiny mercy. Sandra sat across from me at the kitchen table and stared into her cup for several long seconds before speaking. I deleted the Notes app too. The Notes app, she nodded weakly. Cold moved softly through my chest. There was more, Sandra laughed once, brokenly. Sometimes I wrote things down when I didn't have the notebook. The room stayed completely still. Because suddenly I realized the notebook had not merely been an object. It had become a habit, a way of seeing me. That was the real damage. Even without pages, fear had already trained my children to observe life through the lens of possible decline. Then Sandra quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. Sometimes I'd notice things automatically before I even meant to. There it was, exactly. Observation becoming instinct. I stared toward the hallway photographs glowing softly in morning light. No labels now, no categories, yet somehow the house still carried traces of invisible evaluation. Sandra wrapped both hands tightly around her coffee cup. The neurologist said families usually regret not noticing things early enough. Regret again. Fear survives beautifully inside prevention because no one can prove what might have happened otherwise. I looked directly at my daughter. So you became afraid of missing evidence? Tears filled her eyes immediately. Yes, perfect honesty at last, not control, not manipulation, terror. Fear of waking up someday realizing she ignored warning signs too long. That was what made forgiveness possible eventually. Not easy, but possible. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard forgetting entire conversations after exhausting weeks at work. No one panicked. No one documented patterns, because middle-aged forgetfulness feels temporary. Elderly forgetfulness feels predictive. That was the terrifying difference underneath everything. Sandra wiped tears from her face. The notebook made me feel calmer. Calmer, interesting word. Not closer to me, not emotionally connected. Calmer. The notebook regulated her fear the same way the tracker regulated anxiety and the labels rehearsed future loss. Every system had quietly existed to help my children emotionally survive imagined futures. And somewhere inside that process, I slowly stopped being treated like a person living normally in the present. Then another realization surfaced slowly. For months, I whispered, you all experienced me like a problem to monitor instead of a life to share. The room stayed completely still, because there it was again. The deepest wound underneath everything, not the notebook itself, the emotional distance created by constant observation. Sandra covered her mouth instantly, not guilt, not defensiveness, recognition. Because finally she understood too. The notebook had not only recorded my humanity, it interrupted theirs. Then Sandra whispered something that nearly broke my heart. The first time you repeated a story after Dad died, her voice shook. I remember thinking, what if this is the beginning? Beginning, interesting word, not grief, not exhaustion, beginning. Fear had quietly transformed ordinary mourning into imagined trajectory. I folded my hands carefully around the warm coffee cup. You know what the cruelest part was? Sandra remained silent. I started preparing too. Her face changed instantly. What? I tested myself constantly. The tears finally slipped fully down her face then. Names, dates. Memories, my voice cracked slightly now. Every time I forgot something small, I wondered whether you would notice. The kitchen stayed completely still. Because finally the real consequence sat clearly between us. Not hurt feelings, psychological conditioning. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to monitor themselves constantly through imagined decline. Then another realization surfaced slowly. I think part of me even believed the notebook. Sandra cried harder immediately, because somewhere deep down she understood how devastating that was, not because the notes existed. Because repetition creates authority. Tiny observations collected long enough start feeling objective even when they are simply human imperfection viewed through fear. Then another memory surfaced. Ethan asking the same question 4 times during dinner last Christmas. Everyone laughed affectionately. Children repeating themselves feels innocent. Older adults repeating themselves feels clinical. That was the cruel difference. I looked toward Richard's empty chair near the living room window, then quietly asked, "Do you know what I miss most?" Sandra shook her head softly. Being allowed to forget things normally. The sentence settled heavily through the room, because that was it exactly. The quiet dignity of ordinary imperfection without hidden evaluation attached to it. Forgetting names, misplacing receipts, repeating stories. Human things, not evidence. Sandra stood slowly and walked toward the hallway photographs. She touched one frame gently. Then whispered, "I think we became so afraid of someday losing you, we stopped trusting the person who was still fully here." The words broke something open inside me. Not anger, relief. Because finally, maybe for the first time, my daughter understood the actual tragedy underneath everything. Not the notebook, not the observations. The gradual emotional disappearance that begins when older adults stop being experienced as fully reliable versions of themselves in the present. Later that night, after Sandra left, I sat alone beside the living room lamp with Richard's photograph resting in my hands. No labels, no notes, no categories, just memory, just love. Just a life still happening. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not the possibility of decline someday. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly transform ordinary human imperfection into evidence of future disappearance. One repeated story. One forgotten receipt. One emotional year after grief. Tiny moments repeated emotionally until the people who love you stop simply listening to you and start silently measuring how much of you they believe is still left.